think another reason Lewis loved Dante so much is I call him he's a poet of pulses and nerves. He wants to get ideas out of the head into the body, into the will, into the feelings, such that I don't just know what is the right course for me, but I actually viscerally, palpably, bodily crave it. Sort of get those ideas from head into heart, from head into pulses, from head into nerves. And I think the medieval books are particularly good at that.
I always leave these in when I record my intros, and I realize I look like a buffoon when I do that. So today I'm remembering. Anyway, hey everyone, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin, and this is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we explore some of the most difficult questions of theology and history with the goal of trying to bring some level of simplicity out of them. Today was a really fun conversation. I was joined by Dr. Jason Baxter, and we talked about the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis, what he refers to as kind of this third Lewis. We know Lewis the fiction writer, we know Lewis the apologist, but do we actually know the thing that Lewis saw as in many ways most fundamental about him? Well, his day job, his life's work, being a medievalist and reading ancient texts and drawing so much wisdom from them that shaped all of his work. I think a lot of us don't know that side of him, and I'm really excited to get to dive into that today. And we also just talk about the love of learning and the importance of study and all of these things. I think you're going to enjoy it. But before we get to it, I want to say a real quick thank you to my patrons, subscribers, and merch buyers who make this channel possible. Thank you all so much, especially to my patrons who help this channel not only keep going, but growing, supporting me and the channel. Man, so appreciative. They get all types of free fun perks like discounts for merch or free merch, and they get ad-free videos. You should check it out, patreon.com/gospel simplicity. Well, I will not keep you guys from the video any longer. I hope you enjoy it, and here it is. Well, hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I am joined by Dr. Jason Baxter. Dr. Jason Baxter earned his PhD at the University of Notre Dame and teaches at Wyoming Catholic College. He is the author of several books, including An Introduction to Christian Mysticism, A Beginner's Guide to Dante's Divine Comedy, and his most recent, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, which we'll be discussing today. You can learn more about his work and order his books directly, avoiding supporting trillionaire companies, by going to jasonmbaxter.com. And I believe he'll send signed copies if you order it that way. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
That's right. We're going vinyl.
Wonderful. There we go. Well, I love that. So be sure to check that out. That's Jason M. Baxter. The link will be in the description down below. Well, Dr. Baxter, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited for this interview because on a selfish level, it combines two areas that I'm very interested in, both medieval studies and C.S. Lewis, which happened to be conveniently combined in that one person, as C.S. Lewis was a medievalist. And you talk about this area of C.S. Lewis's life, and you call this the third Lewis. It's kind of how you open your book. And you write that we know Lewis the apologist and we know Lewis the fiction writer, but we often forget perhaps an equally important part or fundamental area of his life, and that's that he was a medievalist by trade. Tell me, why do you think it is that we often overlook this, and what are the consequences of this?
Right. He did have a day job. I think in part, well, just in terms of the proportions of what Lewis wrote, most of what gets into print are his apologetics or his fiction. And with respect to his other books, his academic writings are fewer, just fewer in words. But it's a little bit Lewis's fault. He's an old school scholar from the 20th century. He has hugely lofty expectations for his students. The sort of professor who thinks that if you don't know your Latin, your Greek, your French, your Italian, your German, your Old French, your Occitan, and your medieval dialects of Tuscan, then you have no business in the classroom. So it's a little bit Lewis's fault. And he writes his scholarly books, and he doesn't translate his German quotations and his French quotations and his Italian quotations. Obviously, who would need that, right? It's just a cultural knowledge. So I think it's a little bit Lewis's fault. But I don't think it's a little bit our fault too, maybe in two ways. One, we're kind of an intellectually fast food culture. We we prefer TED Talks to 600-page books, right? We want someone to give us immediate and break it down immediately. We don't want to go through the tedious details of acquiring the details of Anglo-Saxon or Old Norse or medieval English dialects. It's hard work. We don't want to spend a year studying the details. Um, and then I think it's also in part because in our culture we privilege above everything else scientific research and its technological products. And so that really has the prestige of the day. In Lewis's day, there was still such a thing as a celebrity English professor. There was still a kind of sense that by talking about lyric poetry or talking about epic or talking about romance, you could do something with that. You could psychologically touch a piece of the soul, a piece of the heart, and it was still important. So I think combining all of those things together, we've kind of forgotten this third Lewis, even though his students at Oxford might not even have known as well the two Lewises that have become famous for us.
That is interesting, and I appreciate the reflections on culture there and how we want things so quickly and we want them in kind of bite-sized pieces versus Lewis's version of having all of the untranslated quotations and making you do the hard intellectual work of understanding what he was up to. And because
Right.
most of my listeners haven't necessarily done that hard intellectual work of checking out his things, maybe not because for any reason of intimidation, or they might just not have known he even did this. But for
Exactly.
those that aren't familiar, could you just kind of bring them or give them a taste of like what were some of the things he was working on in his day job?
Right. Well, I think the good news is that I don't know if I can call us our generation is hungers for depth. And I think we're having a sort of huge allergic reaction to what I call fast food culture, right? That my beloved Italian activist Carlo Petrini, founder of the slow food movement, I think sort of sums up. And we're not just talking about food; we're talking about culture. We're talking about slow culture. I mean, witness long form journalism. Witness what you're doing. Witness what Joe Rogan's doing. So I think we're kind of allergic to this shallowness again. And then I think the good news is if you go on Audible, you'll see that Lewis's scholarly writings are now read and are on Audible as of the last year or two. So I think there's kind of a movement to recognize um, the goods of sort of slow culture. But to speak specifically to Lewis's day job, I thought the best thing to do would just be to read a short passage from this. I think it should give your listeners and viewers some sort of idea of what we're talking about. But there was, as his friend Owen Barfield once said, a third Lewis. In addition to the Christian apologist whose sagacious words delivered over radio waves had been so comforting during England's darkest hour, and in addition to Lewis the Mythmaker, the creator of Narnia and fantastic tales of space travel, there was Lewis the Scholar, the Oxford and later Cambridge Don, who spent his days lecturing to students on medieval cosmology and his nights looking up old words in dictionary. This Lewis, as Louis Marcos puts it, was far more a man of the Middle Age than he was of our own. This was the man who read 14th century medieval texts for his spiritual reading, carefully annotating them with pencil, who summed himself up as chiefly a medievalist, the philologist who wrote essays on semantics, metaphors, etymologies, and textual reception, the distinguished Oxfordonian literary critic who packed lecture theaters with his unscripted reflections on English literature, the schoolmaster who fussed at students for not looking up treacherous words in their lexicons, the polyglot pedant who did not translate his quotations from medieval French, German, Italian, or ancient Latin and Greek in his scholarly books, the man who wrote letters to children recommending that they study Latin until they reach the point they can read it fluently without a dictionary, the critic who single-handedly saved bizarre, lengthy, untranslated ancient books from obscurity.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I love that quote, and I think that that really summarizes what he was up to so well. And I'm excited to kind of dive into that a bit as you do in your book. So you kind of introduced this idea of, hey, like there's this third Lewis that we've been missing out on, and let's look at kind of what shaped him and how we might see that. And so
Right.
following your own lead, that's what we're going to do in this interview today in smaller fashion, and then people can kind of get their appetites whetted for this, and I hope they go check out the book because I know I really enjoyed it myself. So
Great.
one section that jumped out at me that I thought would be a good place to start, and it was actually highlighted in that quote of yours there, is the section on medieval cosmology. In that section, you write the following: what nuclear reactors, particle accelerators, and the Hubble telescope are for us, the medieval cathedral and the cosmological model it represented was for the medieval period a kind of experiment that made visible an elusive and deeper truth. Now, I thought that was really interesting, and I'd love for you to kind of flesh that out a bit. How did medieval cosmology impact the way Lewis saw the world?
Yes. I mean, I want to know more about this myself. I've got to the level where, I feel like I can use the metaphor. But I mean, from what I understand, my introductory reading to high energy particle physics, you have these huge labs, underground, 27-kilometer tracks, right? Like 16 miles around, like in CERN, under the ground. And you try to get a particle or two particles as close to the speed of light as possible. And then you steer these protons into each other, and it creates this almost this sort of cloud of energy in which unstable particles, which allegedly existed at the very beginning of creation, are temporarily brought back into being until they quickly transmute back into more stable things. But that kind of, I think, sort of beautiful image of a world whose even sort of visible structure, or even our sort of traditional model of protons and electrons or so forth, is just one possible variant of a kind of deeper structure which sleeps beneath it, and we can temporarily, iconically, get brief visions of what's underneath by these experiments. I think in its own way, it's just a great way for understanding how medievals thought about literature. In a pre-scientific age, before Galileo, before Descartes, before Newton, I think architecture, painting, and literature does the work, the cultural work that now science and technology do for us. Literature was almost kind of experimental. It was sort of imagining scenes in which there's high energy scenes, high energy particles of the soul, and stressful conditions, and put in unusual positions where something of the depths is revealed. So analogically, thinking about one of these sort of Gothic cathedrals, the medievals believed that the universe was fundamentally a symphony, this fundamental sort of symphony of cosmic order. They literally believed, of course, we all know about the Earth being at the center of the Earth, but that the planets are sort of spaced out in proportions which make chords. And so Lewis warns us that, when we're talking about medieval text, we sometimes think they're being metaphorical, like calling the universe is a symphony, when they're not being very metaphorical at all. They're actually being a little bit literal here. But they think the sort of deep structures of harmony, of sort of symphonic nature, is built into the cosmos. The problem, in part because of our sinfulness, in part because of our preference for easy to grab bodily goods, we become deaf to it. And the metaphor they love to use was, just as if you live near a waterfall, eventually you stop hearing it. So too, living in a symphonic universe, at some point you stop hearing the harmonies. And thus you need a supertext, a hypertext, a hyper piece of architecture, which makes all those principles of cosmic harmonic order obvious and evident again. And if your viewers have stepped into one of these old world cathedrals, I mean, something like Chartres or something like Salisbury in England, then you recognize that it's a picture of abundance. There's variety, there's order, but 10 times more than you might see. And so in that sense, the analogy, I think, comes what we do through force and speed and momentum in the world of physics, they did through abundance and variety and patterning in the pre-scientific world of literature. But analogously, there's an attempt to sort of create a sense of the deep structure, which we know is there, but is difficult for our senses to perceive. So if that's what architecture does, and if that's what literature does, if you just take my analogy of the sort of, high-speed particle accelerator in the pre-scientific age, the cathedral, the poem, those things can help sort of retune our attentiveness to that which is always all around us, but we've become deaf or blind to. It's restores our ability. I sometimes use switching from particle accelerators to X-rays. It restores our ability to have X-ray vision into the spiritual basis of the world. I think that's what fascinated Lewis so much. Not just the sacramental view of the cosmos, but the implications that that has for living well, for being deep, for having friendship, for that medieval literature, that in some sense mythology is not this superfluous intellectual game that we play, but we actually need access to those stories, analogously to how CERN needs its magnetic coils to speed up the protons.
Wow, that's so interesting to me, and I love the way that you related those two worlds to help us see kind of how that gets at these fundamental ideas. And I couldn't help but think of his fellow, I believe he was also at Oxford, Tolkien, with the Silmarillion and creation kind of coming out of song there, and kind of the harmony and dissonance there. I could see some connections there, which I think is really interesting. But
Well,
speaking of,
I mean,
yeah,
both
go
Lewis
ahead.
and Tolkien, both Lewis and Tolkien, to a certain extent, in the best possible use of the term, are plagiarizers, and that's what the book is about. But in fact, there's a medieval theory of composition, which I also talk about in the book, in which you shouldn't think about composition as necessarily the demand to find your own original voice and to say something that no human being has ever said in the world. But you could be a recycler, you could be a reuser, you could take old stories, trim them down, add them up, rebuild the world, make it new. And so just thinking about your Tolkien, I mean, of course, that's what I argue exactly was happening in Lewis. But Tolkien, too, of course, being a professor of Germanic languages, Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse and Old German, was a huge fan of the Anglo-Saxon translation of Boethius. And in Boethius, you have this cosmic harmonic picture of the world. So I think when Tolkien rewrites the Silmarillion of singing the universe into existence, he's just being a really faithful, humble, pious plagiarizer of something which was ubiquitously available in the Middle Ages, beginning with Boethius.
It's no secret that today, perhaps more than ever, people are struggling with their mental health. I think if I asked you all to virtually raise your hand and said, hey, are you currently struggling? Do you consistently struggle with mental health, be it anxiety, depression, or whatever? I think many of us, myself included, would raise our hand and say, yeah, like things get hard sometimes, and sometimes it feels like more than we can handle. But the problem is, despite facing these difficult circumstances and dealing with these mental health crises at times, so few of us end up actually getting the help that we need. It might be because it can take so long to get into a counselor or therapist, or you think it's going to be too much, or maybe there's this thought in the back of your head that Christians aren't allowed to have mental health problems, and does that mean there's something wrong with me? Well, from the beginning of my channel, far before it had any type of reach or influence, I have wanted to do my part to help end that stigma. That's why one of my first videos I ever made was titled, "You Can Have Jesus and a Therapist Too," hoping that would give people the permission to go out and get the help they need without being worried about these shameful stigmas that people have attached to it. Well, now I am so excited to be partnering with Faithful Counseling, who are leading the charge in helping people get the help they need. Rather than having to wait months to get into a counselor, if you sign up for Faithful Counseling, you can be paired with a counselor in 24 hours or less. I don't know if you've ever attempted to do something like this through traditional avenues, but if you have, you know just how crazy it is to be able to pair up with someone that quickly. All of their counselors are licensed and have over 3,000 hours of experience. You can connect with them in flexible ways. You can do video sessions, phone calls, private messaging. It is really fantastic. They even have a live chat. It is such an amazing service. I'm so excited to be partnering with them, and I'd really encourage you to check them out by going to faithfulcounseling.com/gospelsimplicity. If you do so, you'll get 10% off your first month, and I think it will be really, really helpful for you. Now, I do want to say that this isn't a crisis line, and if you are experiencing suicidal thoughts or ideation, I would encourage you so much to not go through this alone, but to reach out to a crisis line. I'll put one on the screen here. But if you are looking for mental health help, I think Faithful Counseling could be great for you. They will connect you with a Christian counselor, and I know people come to my channel from a variety of backgrounds. So if you want one specifically from your Christian denomination, they will work with you to try to make that happen so that you can get Christian mental health help. I think it's going to be fantastic for you. I can't wait for you to check it out. Again, that's faithfulcounseling.com/gospel-simplicity. You get 10% off your first month. After that, it'll be $260 per month, but there is financial aid available for those who qualify. Once again, guys, don't hesitate to get the help you need. faithfulcounseling.com/gospel-simplicity. Yeah, and I think, even that whole model of faithful plagiarizing there, I like the way you put that. It kind of gets at an interesting scholarly question, which is probably too far down a rabbit trail for today, but just the idea of what they saw themselves doing is taking kind of the best of the past and reworking that, rather than just kind of banishing everything from the past and thinking that everything has to be made new, which I think might be insightful in and of itself there. But there's one area I'd like to pivot to here, because I know it's a particular area of expertise for you, and I think it's going to be exciting to jump into, and that is Lewis' appreciation of Dante. Now, you devote a whole chapter to this in your book, whom Lewis describes as the greatest poet he has read, which I thought was really interesting because he was certainly a well-read man. Like Dante, Lewis is famous for his creative depictions of hell. However, that's not the only connection that we can see between them. And you really show that it's not just, hey, look, they both wrote books about hell, and that's kind of cool. There's a lot more there. Could you share with us what Lewis saw in Dante and how that ended up coming out in his work?
Sure. I'll give you the quotation. I think Dante's poetry, says Lewis, on the whole, the greatest of all the poetry I have read. Yet when it is at its highest pitch of excellence, I hardly feel that Dante has very much to do. So in some sense, his first compliment to Dante said, Dante is just at the top of a hill and there's a huge rock, and Dante just goes boink, and the rock starts rolling down the hill. That in some sense, precisely for the reasons we talked about, if the cosmos is already a symphony, if the cosmos is a cathedral, then you just have to represent your cosmos, and you've already created a poem. You just have to be accurate. You just have to be a realist, and you've got a symphony into verse. That's Lewis's first compliment to Dante, and it's a funny compliment, saying, "Well, yeah, he didn't actually do anything." Right? But I think the interesting thing is that I think you're right that our own imagination, when we say Dante, we almost always think of hell, and we think of the mud fights and the people biting each other and the fist fights of hell, and what I like to call the heavy metal of Inferno. But then I think Lewis loved most of all Dante's Paradiso, Dante's heaven. And I think the reason he loved it is a mystery that he touches on in in one of his top 3 essays, Transposition, as good as Weight of Glory and as good as his Cambridge inaugural address in 1954. But in Transposition, Lewis uses this extraordinary analogy, and we have to think about before recordings. If you love, we'll just take an example. I use this example in the book of Mahler, right? Mahler is famous in the early 20th century for these huge symphonies. He has sometimes 300 to 400 instrumentalists, and sometimes a choir of 400 or 500 people. He's got the symphony for 1,000, right? Mahler's so complex and so many variety of sounds. Well, in an era before recordings, what do you do if you didn't have a chance to go hear Mahler's Eighth? Well, you get a piano score for it, and you play Mahler's symphony, but on a piano. It's a transposition. Lewis is so interested in this idea that in some sense, when I play, my D, sometimes it means a violin and sometimes it means a flute with respect to the original. That's Lewis's image. That's Lewis's analogy for the iconic universe, is that there's this world of pulsating, fiery joy, and we call it, and we call it goodness. But even when we use the word goodness, we're already reducing in our mental categories. It seems like hell's fun and paradise is boring because it's just a bunch of angels plucking citharas, right? But if you have this idea of the transposition, it means that we're only getting a tenth, I don't know, a thousandth, a millionth of the sort of like oceanic fire of spark and happiness and joy. And so Lewis thought, and he says this in Transposition and elsewhere, Lewis thought that the negatives always have the advantage over the positives. And so when we're talking about heaven or when we're talking about goodness, we're always saying in some sense what it's not. And in heaven, there won't be these kind of bodily pleasures that we think of and are attracted to as the greatest good of this life. And we think, heaven sounds lame. You can't do that in heaven. That's the only thing I think about, right? Why would I want to go there? Thus the unfair advantage of the negatives. This is where Dante comes in. Because the way that Dante creates his poetry is what I call kaleidoscopic. That is, he uses a metaphor and says, it was like this. For example, he describes heaven. It was like a series of soldiers marching. But then Dante changes his mind and says, no. It was more like a garden in which there were a million different flowers. No. It actually, everyone was like a petal on a single rose. No. It was actually like a river of sparks, and he keeps changing his metaphors kaleidoscopically. And what Lewis thought that did, it gave a sense of heaviness, a sense of density, which could help the positives, the spiritual positives, win the war against the ghostly negatives, so that we would begin to feel our own temporal spatial existence as light and shadowy with respect to the heavier, denser, hotter, higher energy, to go back to our metaphor earlier, reality of heavenly bliss. And Dante thought that no one did that better. Sorry, Lewis thought that no one did that better than Dante Alighieri, 14th century Italian poet.
If you're anything like me, you might have this vague sense that you should be investing, or maybe you actively want to invest, but you just find the whole thing a little confusing. I've been there. I totally get that. Between wondering what should you buy and where should you invest, which companies do you pick and when do you pick them, and on top of all of that, how do you know that your money isn't going to be supporting companies that are against your moral values? To be honest, it's all very complex, but that is where Christ-centered capital comes in. C3. C3 is an organization that exists to help you not only be a good steward of your money and be able to invest wisely by giving you timely stock picks, mock portfolios, even alternative investing opportunities like crypto and all of that and so much more, but they do it in a way that gives you ratings of these companies based on what they are supporting and whether or not they would line up with Christian moral convictions. It's amazing, it's so helpful, and allows you to take that investing to a more conscious level and see, is this really something that I would want to be supporting? I highly recommend you check them out, and you can do so by going to christcenteredcapital.com. And if you do, be sure to use the promo code C3Austin for your first month absolutely free. You don't even have to pay anything. You can see if you like it, see what kind of services they offer you. After that, it would be $7 per month. And just so you know, 50% of those profits will be going back into Christian organizations like pro-life organizations, Christian colleges, and much, much more. They're a great organization that I'm so happy to be partnering with. And again, I'd encourage you to check them out at christcenteredcapital.com and use the promo code C3Austin to get your first month free. That's so interesting, and I love that kind of connection to the transposition idea, and it really does get at an interesting way in which we see Lewis as he attempts to describe kind of these seemingly ineffable things in various works of his, which is really interesting to kind of see the undercurrent of where that comes from. Now, my goal in this interview specifically is to highlight what Lewis is doing, but I think, to be true to Lewis would be to kind of take this little rabbit trail, and we're going to take another one here in a second, of allowing people to kind of learn more about these works that he so greatly loved. And I know your love for Dante is also immense, and you've written on him and you've done a lot of work there. And so in the vein of people trying to kind of push back against what we've called like a fast food culture here, and to be people of depth and to love the humanities, if you will, or to go into these sources from the past and really sit with them and learn from them, What recommendations would you give for people who come away from this and are like, yeah, I want to be the kind of person that reads Dante and I want to dive into that and to really
Right.
kind of educate myself in this way, but reading Dante kind of
Right.
scares me. Like, I don't know what to do there. I know you've got a book on
Right.
this subject, but where
Yeah.
would you
Yeah. Yeah.
recommend they start?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's exactly the audience that I had in mind, was smart people who, as one writer said, who think of Dante as the Mount Everest, and it's this kind of cool thing that in theory you'd like to climb, but then you realize it's what, 25,000 feet above sea level, and you, the oxygen's really thin up there, and you need some help. You need someone just to say, "Don't you get it?" So I think, yeah, I think we crave that depth. Um, we want to be the sort of person that when a friend comes to us in a time of need, that we have something rich, something nourishing to give. And I think that's the beautiful thing about Lewis. Obviously, Lewis had advice to give, drew so many of these things through. I guess maybe here's the thing: it's not just reading old books. Lewis says for every new book you read, you should read an old book, and you should sort of pivot back and have this balanced diet. But I think to the extent you can do it, it's about study. And what is study? Well, study in its essence is it's the medievals used to use this metaphor of chewing. In fact, it's even a biblical metaphor, isn't it? Right? Ezekiel is handed the word of God, handed a scroll, and he's told to eat it, and he eats it and chews on it, and he says it tasted sweet unto my mouth. We got to do that with respect to our books, right? We got to chew on them until we get something out of them. And I think this is again related to what we were saying about Dante. I think another reason Lewis loved Dante so much is I call him he's a poet of pulses and nerves. He wants to get ideas out of the head into the body, into the will, into the feelings, such that I don't just know what is the right course for me, but I actually viscerally, palpably, bodily crave it. Sort of get those ideas from head into heart, from head into pulses, from head into nerves. And I think the medieval books are particularly good at that. Yeah, so that's always I think that's one of the most fun things about writing this book is that, yeah, I wanted to use the great books, these especially this medieval and pre-modern text, to help us understand the mind of Lewis. But I also had hoped that, say, well, look, people love Lewis, they come to it, they might actually turn around and start loving the old things that he loved, and they could begin to develop this sort of balanced diet of one to one. And I guess the other thing I would just throw out there is, look, in an age of isolation, in an age of atomism, in an age of loneliness, in an age of anxiety, in the age of me projecting my image, but feeling afraid that my self doesn't actually live up to my image. I think to the extent we can, we got to be together. We got to be in communion. We got to read these things together. So here's the ideal scenario, I suppose, for some of your readers who think, man, Dante sounds cool too. Um, I wrote the book for you, the Dante book. But a cool thing to do would be, I think, getting together on a weekly basis, maybe every other week, and reading aloud. Get those words from thoughts into performance, into visible, audible space. Read them aloud, perform them for each other. Maybe read three or four. Um, have a glass of wine, or maybe some sort of drink actually paired with the with the particular canticle that you're in. So maybe, I don't know, like hot spicy salsa for Inferno, and plain things like beer and bread for Purgatorio, and lush divine things like chocolate mousse and champagne for Paradiso. Right? Get it into your nerves and your body. Read them aloud, talk about them, and I think so much about Dante's is, well, not just the what that's important, but it's about the how, and it's about the why, and it's about what he does, what his images do to trigger these deeper, what I'm calling heart responses, not just head responses. So that's a possible way of doing what the medievals doing, and chewing on these ancient texts until we fully release their flavor.
That just sounds fantastic. I love that idea. And I encourage people, I there's a decent sized community of people that watch these videos, and I imagine there might be people in an area near you that would be interested in getting involved in something like this. So, to the extent that my channel can be a place to help people connect with one another, to facilitate what sounds like such an amazing group setting to me, that would be really exciting. And so, if people have ideas in the
Yeah.
comments down below, let me know if I can be of help to you all in facilitating, helping connect people, because I think that would just be wonderful.
I kind of
Well,
got
there's a,
myself excited about it. Yeah.
I know, like I want to go. Let's make this
Let's
happen.
do this.
All right. So the next area I want to talk about here, and this is partially self-indulgent because specifically my interest in the medieval period kind of is most acutely in the area of medieval mysticism. And you devote a chapter to C.S. Lewis' appreciation, but also kind of interesting relationship with the mystics. He would come close to soaring to these mystical heights in his writings, and then he would kind of back off and say, well, I'm not a mystic, and we'll see, we'll leave that to them in a certain way. And he would also say that he's not an expert in the mystics or in such things, but he did love them. And you, in that early quote, I think the first one you offered, that he read these 14th century spiritual texts as his own and enjoyed them so deeply. So despite maybe, I don't even know if reservations is the right word, but his cautious relationship with mysticism, you see a connection there between Lewis and medieval mysticism. Could you flesh that out for us a bit, and how do we see that in Lewis?
Right. Yeah. So I think one of the funny things about Lewis's own safeguarding of the mystical tradition and rarely publicly recommending it or getting really close to it and then saying, like he does in Weight of Glory, like he does at the end of Four Loves, he comes so close in which he wants to meditate on how the pleasure of loving God is like any single pleasure you would enjoy on earth, but magnified and all enjoyed simultaneously. As a sort of good pastoral, pastorally concerned person, I think he's worried that we'll try to skip to the end. We'll try to skip to the good stuff. And in my mysticism book, I jokingly talk about, the person who's cuts people off and flips off drivers driving in his or her Prius to get to yoga, right? That you have to be a good human being, charitable, diligent, faithful, full of all the old virtues of all of those kind of like ancient Aeneas-like virtues of piety and fidelity and self-discipline before you can get to the level of that kind of spiritual depth. So I think that's why Lewis is always so cautious of hedging his own thoughts, in which he sort of gives a taste of it, but then backs off it and says, but as he says in Weight of Glory, tomorrow is a Monday morning. And that means you got to get up, and that means you got to have eyes wide open for people of need around you. If you're so spiritual that you don't feel the woundedness of yourself and the woundedness of others and have a sense of embodied compassion for them and love them and care for them, and then just do your regular things like not yell at your kids and and have some sort of alertness of charity, then you're not going to be a mystic. You're going to be a faker. You're going to be a pseudo mystic who thinks that he or she is deep and is not. I think that's what Lewis was really worried about, and that's why I think every time he mentions it, he wants to sort of back off it. And ironically, one of his favorite mystical texts, The Cloud of Unknowing, the author begins exactly there, saying, "Look, if you've come across this book, don't tell anyone else about it. Don't let anyone else read it. This is the sort of thing. Look, if people are hungry, if people are thirsty, they'll get the book. But don't just go around giving it to everyone, because a lot of people aren't yet ready. They don't love so much in an ordinary way that they're ready to love in a supernatural way." So, ironically, by pushing medieval texts under the bus, Lewis was doing what the medieval authors themselves had done, safeguarding these kind of richest, deepest, most intimate practices from those who would not use them well, because they weren't ready for them. They haven't passed through these preliminary levels of unprying the grasp of their hands on these worldly goods, right? These sort of these awful tendencies that we have to envy, right? That your best friend calls and says, I just got this amazing new job opportunity. And your first thought is, damn it, right? That kind of envious. We got to work on that kind of stuff, as well as the obvious ones of the avarice and the lust and the sort of self-absorption and that sort of thing. We gotta do that first, says the mystical tradition itself, before you get to the good stuff of these divine fiery ascents where you look into the black hole of being and it looks back at you and you are known and you are loved, and like Dante describes at the end of Paradiso 33.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think it is probably a fair pastoral concern in some ways, that even more so today, that we want like a microwaved mysticism. Like I don't want to spend the years of waking up at 5 a.m. and praying the hours every day or doing this or that, but like can I have these mystical experiences at the end of your like 10-day online free course or whatever? Or it's probably not free. You probably had to pay a lot for that 10-day course.
Yeah,
But
$87, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so I can understand that, but it is so interesting that
Right.
worry is already there in some of those medieval texts. Now, at the same
Right.
time, if you tell people, don't tell your friends about this book and don't share it, it's probably actually a great marketing technique to get your book,
Best
spread very
marketing technique,
widely.
yeah.
But in any
Here's an
case,
awful book you shouldn't read, yeah.
right, and then it's
But an
everywhere.
amazing book you can't yet handle. Don't buy it, please.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. I'll
Yeah.
keep that in mind should I ever write a book. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
this is another topic that you've written a whole nother book on. And I must confess here real quickly, I
Right.
don't think I told you this in our emailing, but at the end of last year, I had set up kind of like a, first quarter of 2022 kind of guest and topic list. And I had seen your book on this and put that down
Yeah.
as like, oh, I've got to do an interview on that. I'll have to see. And
Cool.
then I have a relationship with IVP, and this book came across, and I didn't
Right.
realize it was the same person. So it wasn't until I was like looking into your book, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful. So who knows? Maybe we'll have to
Providence.
check out that book sometime. But for
Yeah.
kind of the just dipping their toes in for people who are interested in this and they do want to do it right, and they think, man, like
Yes.
I would love to read some of these texts that
Yes.
maybe Lewis was reading,
Yes.
but the mystical
Yes.
tradition, it is varied. There's a lot of
Yes.
it. Like, where in the
Yes.
world should I start? What would you say to them?
Right. Right. Yeah. Again, I mean, that's the sort of question I tried to contemplate in that book. Of, I think I said this in the book. If not, this is what I meant. Is that I thought of myself as someone who's going down to the basement of the church, or maybe the attic of the church, and rummaging around a little bit and finding really bizarre things. Allegedly, there are more paintings in in the basements of Italian museums that are just undocumented and stored away than there are above ground in the rest of European museums. And so I had that sort of image as I was writing, that just go down to the basement of the church and see what kinds of weird things are down there. And I wanted to sort of bring those up, just take off the wrapping and hang it up and take a look at it and describe it, and not make it feel relevant again, without trying to say that it's perfect in every possible way, but just create a dialogue. Again, that one-to-one reading ratio that Lewis describes. And so, I mean, that's what the book is about. It's kind of, grabs those individual portraits, brings them up and says, is this brilliant? I mean, every now and then I think, reading with my students, this is one of my favorite things to do. We grab a lyric poem, maybe something written in the last 50 years, and we read it together. And the question is, brilliant or stupid, right? And sometimes the modernist poetry, it's hard to tell. I wanted to do something like this. Is this brilliant? Do we need this? Is this the type of nutrition, like eating an orange in late November, that your soul craves? Or is this something that we've gotten over? So, in light of that, Gregory of Nyssa, his Life of Moses, an allegorical reading of Moses. Now, again, it's one of those kind of funny texts in which it takes you a long time to get to the good stuff. But Gregory does have some real good stuff in there. And he has this sort of extraordinary image of that heaven is a dynamic reality. And I don't think we often think that. Dante picks this up, maybe not from Gregory of Nyssa, but he picks it up. That is, your ability to see the light of God is dependent on your capacity to love. And so you go with a capacity to love, and to the extent you have that love and capacity, you see into this bottomless oceanic depth of God. But what you see is amazing and marvelous and delightful, and it astonishes you. And in that moment of astonishment, the fire of your love grows somewhat. But when that happens, your capacity to see correspondingly grows. And so you see a little bit deeper down and are astonished by that, which increases your love. And so Gregory of Nyssa has this idea of ultimate sort of beatific vision. It's a dynamic process in which I'm always falling, and I'm always falling in love forever, simultaneously outside of time. And I think when you begin to contemplate that, right, it's mind blowing. I mean, because we think of these sort of like ultimate realities as so dull, don't we? And Gregory of Nyssa, I think, just shatters our images. Now, look, you got to read 87 pages of weird commentary and emphasis on ascesis, emphasis on detaching the body from these kind of like sick, unhealthy cravings in a way which I think is difficult for us and bothersome to us because I think rightly so. We have a generally affirmative approach to the cosmos and we see it as a gift. And I think that's something that we bring to the tradition, which is good. And yet, these ancient authors have something to tell us, not just in terms of the good stuff, but in terms of the stuff we don't really want to hear along the way. Anyway, so that's an example, Gregory of Nyssa. I mean, there's Dionysius, the Areopagite, 6th century Byzantine theologian who's really, really hard, writes a 5-page treatise, which is, I think you could say, the beating heart of mysticism. Super hard, but if you just go into it with the expectation of reading it 17 times before you understand, you won't be disappointed. There are the sermons of Meister Eckhart, which I do not think are perfect in every possible way, but I describe him as God's rock hammer. And I think what Meister Eckhart brings to the table is liberating us modern Christians from the tacit, unexamined background belief that being good is what Christianity is about, morality. And Eckhart comes and destroys that and says, no, look, morality is secondary. What we really need is vision of the good. And when that comes, you have charity. And ultimately, the Christian life is one of a kind of dancing, orchestral joy. And your goodness flows out of that. Incidentally, we could pivot back to Lewis. That's what my last chapter is about in the Lewis book, is why Lewis needs the mythology, why Lewis has these strange moments in which all of a sudden Bacchus shows up. And there's a weird Dionysian parade of because I think ultimately Lewis feels that reading his author, reading authors like Suda Dionysius and so forth, that the ultimate vision of reality is so ridiculously freeing that to reduce Christianity to moral categories is a huge mistake. And so Lewis has to bust these things open, and he does it by dragging back in all these ancient, bizarre mythological scenes and blending them all together, even though that irritated a meticulous author like Tolkien.
That is wonderful, though, the way that he can bring together so many of these different things. And it takes, I think, that true life of scholarship that he had devoted himself to, or at least that life of study and being interested in things and doing that hard work and reading texts that it takes reading them 17 times to get it.
Right.
But doing it because it's worth it, and then being able to see how that's going to enrich your whole vision of what the Christian life is and being able to kind of shatter those smaller categories. I think that's really, really interesting about Lewis. And I also appreciate what... Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think you just put your finger on the pulse of how Lewis saw his own vocation, and I recommend it to all of your viewers and listeners that there's a little essay called "Meditation on the Toolshed," and it's strikingly brilliant. He steps into a kind of like garage shop, and he sees a little beam of light coming through a crack in it, and he looks at it for a while, sort of suspended in dust particles, and he's looking at the beam. But then he says, what if I just walked around and looked along the beam, right? Well, then the beam disappears and all you see is the sky behind. I think Lewis thought of his whole career as sort of pivoting back and forth, looking at the beam, then looking along the beam, at the beam, then along the beam. So in some sense, what you said, right? Fact gathering is, I think, pedantic and professorial, and people hate it. If you forget that when you've accumulated enough facts, then you can pivot and look along the beam and feel that world from within. But if you don't gather enough of them, you're not actually looking along the beam. And so you have to sort of pivot back and forth, I think, in terms of, and maybe you could even say that's what study means. And we all know that, look, you're just reading a textbook. And if no one actually says, do you realize what, if no one actually gets you to look along the beam, it just seems pointless and tedious and pedantic, doesn't it? But on the other hand, it's really the only way into that access to these extraordinarily foreign worlds. So I think you said it perfectly, just sort of that pivoting back and forth between that sort of breathing in and breathing out of the scholarly life.
Yeah,
Or just
that's
the life of
wonderful.
depth.
Yes, exactly. And if faithful listeners to this show go, man, I know I haven't read that, but that sounds familiar. They might have heard. I had Dr. Rachel Fulton Brown on the show talking about the hours
Yes.
of the Virgin Mary and kind of how medieval interpreters saw Mary. And she opens her book with
Yes.
that very meditation and kind of how
Yes.
it's shaped what she wanted to do there. So if people are trying to wonder where that connection might be
Yes.
from, that might be where you guys heard that.
Yeah.
And I think
The
it's a
sort
very
of mystery
powerful
of carrying
image.
something, depth in your very body. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And so I can imagine, and we've talked about this throughout, but I think a lot of people are going to be yearning for this depth, and they want to have this life of study. And for someone like me, this is really appealing because I'm a senior in my undergraduate program. I'm applying to graduate schools. Like this is fun. Yeah, like I'm going into a life of study at least for the
Yeah,
next
this
few
is
years.
the fun part. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the easy part. But I also know I have a lot of listeners who are going to say, like, man, that sounds wonderful, like this life of study. But
Yeah.
I've got a 40-hour plus, hour a week job.
Yeah.
I've got
Right.
kids. I've got this or that.
Right.
Like, yeah, it sounds wonderful to get to, sit around Oxford smoking a pipe and reading, old Latin texts, but like no
Yeah.
one's paying me to do that right now. And so
Mhm.
again, while on the one hand we want to get away from kind of the microwave culture of these things,
Yes.
that like there isn't a replacement for doing the hard work and for parsing your Latin verbs at some
Right.
point.
Right.
But on the other hand, in what ways can we kind of make this vision accessible to those who don't have the luxury of getting to kind of lead
Yes.
a traditionally scholarly life? What advice would you have for
Right.
those people specifically who see in Lewis a great hero? They've learned this new side
Yes.
of him. They want to walk in those footsteps, but in their own way that, involves going to work and having dinner with the
Yes.
kids and all of those things.
Absolutely. I have immense amount of understanding for that and appreciation for that question. And I guess I would just would like to begin by just with a word of encouragement. Is I think it's a dynamic process, right? It's not. You're right. I think it's. I mean, look, I mean, when you live in a world like we do, one of the fascinating things is that there's this sort of professionalization of everything, right? Like there's the professionalization of football. So why would you play, football in the front yard when you're, not going to go pro, right? You're like on a track to be the best in the world and then you get off it. Or like we don't really sing anymore as a culture, right? We don't sing our own songs. I mean, we might just sing bits and pieces, but in some sense, the ubiquitousness of professional singers in our lives, I think, make us look, feel smaller or lack confidence. And there's this sort of like professionalization of everything. And so maybe in some sense the intimidating thing is like, well, we have now the extraordinary access to bring professional scholars, like you mentioned Rachel Fulton Brown, into my living room. I can't do what she does. She's amazing, right? Why would I even try? And so I think just the sort of recovery of a good amateurish culture, a real love, and as a dynamic process, right? So I don't know. I guess I would just say, I mean, I don't know. I'm a million different pieces of advice are rushing through my head right now. Begin somewhere. Begin somewhere. Can you give 15 minutes of depth or 25 minutes a day? Right. I mean, we're not, Thomas More, who gets up at 4:30 a.m. and studied for 2.5 hours before he spent the whole day working as a judge. We could do that, but I wouldn't worry about getting there right now. but I think for ordinary Christians, study is important, and it's something which is dropped off our radar. The sort of necessity of these intellectual tools. So I don't know. Can you start with 25 minutes a day? Can you? I mean, everyone, we all get our screen time reports from our phones, don't we? I mean, uh, I'm not an addict, and I average an hour and 57 minutes a day. To that extent, I've started to try to be a little bit more aggressive. I've deleted all of my apps of connectivity except for text and calling. Get rid of your web browser. Just do some of your social media stuff on a computer, but within a confined time. That'll give you more time, and all of a sudden you'll be sitting there at a bus stop or a subway stop, and you'll think, well, I could read a couple of pages. I could listen to a couple of minutes from Audible. Can you? I think I love reading about sports, and especially football, especially Notre Dame football. Hopefully that won't irritate too many of your viewers. But can I spend less time doing that, and create a little bit of space in my schedule for quality? I'm not asking for a complete eradication of, but maybe something like the ascesis that the ancient authors tell about happens for us with respect to time, and not necessarily with respect to sort of bodily deprivations. Can I pray first before I re-listen to my favorite album on the way to work? Tiny things like that. And then I think, again, like I said, in our age of what has been called the age of bowling alone, right? Our age of atomism, our age of anxiety, our individualism. Can I get a couple of loyal, faithful friends together in which we make a commitment, and we have some kind of community in which we are trying to engage in depth, trying to engage with depth in some sort of capacity? So there are just a couple of thoughts that, first of all, don't get discouraged as a process. Secondly, just begin with minutes. Just begin with minutes. And maybe a little bit of ascesis with respect to our technological devices and our sort of diffusive use of time. And then community, because we're bodily beings, and we're moved by each other, and we long for goodness in the presence of one another. And I feel like that's a good little start right there. And that's a meaningful start. Make it habitual. And then you'll be in a position to exercise some prudence. You might be able to go from 25 minutes to 32 minutes, right? Or you might be able to go from once a month to every other week or something like that. So those are a couple of pieces of advice.
I really appreciate all of those facets that you brought together there. And I think especially today there is such a hesitation to do anything that we're not going to be the best at. And I've recognized
Yes.
that in my own life that, you take things up as a kid because it was fun. And
Right.
then eventually you
Yes.
saw people were better at it than you and you weren't going to be the best. So you
Yes.
dropped that thing and you picked
That's
something
right.
else up. And then
That's right.
you start looking at things, you're like, man, I'm never going to be the best at this. I've started too late, and should I even
Yes.
try? And I think it's such an important
Yes.
thing to come back to, just questioning uh, that assumption that in order to do something, we need to be the best at it. Why is it that that would be? And could we get into these things for the joy of doing them and kind of take a slow approach to it? So
Right.
I
Right.
really appreciate that.
I can give
And
one little micro example of
yeah.
that. I mean, I think, yeah, you sort of, it's what I call being fit into a grid, being fit into
Mhm.
basically viewing your life as a work function. And I definitely have a tendency toward that. And so a couple of years ago, with some advice from a good friend, I took up the piano again after a 20-year break. I had forgotten how to read the notes. I had to have my children come remind me that, of FACE, this is sort of the spaces in the treble clef. And I felt this thing way back from me, this like early teenage thing in me, like this knowledge trying to work its way back into my body and try to work it out. I got to the point where I can play a dumbed down intermediate piece of Bach, and it's not very good performance. And um, but 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 for a brief minute, I, to whatever extent, I feel Bach. I feel it in my nerves. I feel it in my pulses. I sort of share his mind for a brief moment, and it's imperfect, and I'm not going to perform for anyone, and I'm not going to impress anyone. But I think it gives a kind of shared, along the beam kind of knowledge, which makes me love that man and love his music, even if imperfectly.
I think that's such a wonderful example of that. And even on another level, I think at the level we're talking about is so important that we need to just get over that idea of I need to be the best. And simultaneously, not that I necessarily want to reinforce a tendency that I see in myself and others, but of this kind of hyper productivity or kind of making it, hyper optimizing things. But for those people, to throw them a bit of a bone, to be continually learning is going to help you become better at things. Like, I think so often we get so hyper specialized in one thing that we lose any sense of being well rounded, and we kind of actually
Right.
deteriorate in those skills to learn new things. But in
Yes.
kind of applying ourselves to diverse things, like picking up the piano after 20 years, it's going to
Yes.
help your brain start firing in new ways and making connections between kind of disparate things, which I think is really important,
Right.
no matter what we're
Right.
doing. And also just makes us kind of more interesting people. And that's kind
Well,
of where go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say the medievals, I think, were very wise about this too. They said that basically the goal of the life of study was for me to make my interior microcosm, my own sort of world of my universe, resemble the exterior macrocosm. And I think, in some sense, when you do exactly what you were doing, and we love these many things, we're, I don't know, it'd be like an astrophysicist who were only interested in sunbeams. Like, well, what about what about black holes and and gravity and expanding universes and all that? No, I just focus on the sun. In some sense, the astrophysicist, he or she has to take into account the rich diversity of patterns and movements and gravitational experiences of the universe, right? I think the medievals thought that, in a way, that was the sort of analogy for cultivating ourselves. And I think when we do that, we become richer, we become more universe-like. We have more loves, we love more things properly, and and we also become humble, because I recognize that I'm not a very good pianist. And thus, those who are supremely gifted, I actually need them. And so, in some sense, by trying to perfect my inner microcosm, I then realize, oh, right, I am imperfect by myself. And I actually need a community of friendship to be in communion with, because they perfect me. And if they have it, they can pull from me loves that in me are only imperfectly developed.
Yeah, and on a, kind of a pastoral level, I suppose, I think that's such a beautiful way of relating to people, in a way that we need a community to resource one another and draw out loves in one another, rather than being in constant competition with each other, which I think is a default for so many of us. We would see, I think we're taught that I'm an imperfect piano player and they're a perfect piano player, which means I need to either quit so that I don't feel this dissonance of being in competition with you and losing, or I need to work really hard so I can be better than you. But rather to see it as this community of learning and drawing out those loves in one another, I think it's really
Mhm.
important. That's kind of where I wanted to wrap up for today, was pointing out this, throughout we've talked about kind of becoming more well-rounded or interesting, pursuing these things, but I want to be careful that I don't phrase it in such a way that the goal of this is to just kind of puff ourselves up so that we can, appear intellectual or appear smart, which
Sure.
I think it's great to pursue a life of the mind, and I would love for people to do so. But I
Mhm.
think the posture you put there of being one of humility is really important. And I'm just curious, is there anything else you'd like to say about that as people pursue these things, I've seen in the settings that I'm in, it can become this thing of, yes, I've read Dante and that somehow makes me far more interesting or better than you. You might be a
Yes.
more interesting conversation partner, but I
Right.
think we have to be careful not to allow this to kind of fuel this sense of pride and superiority. So what advice would you
Yes.
give for people as they take this excitement, which I think is a good excitement to pursue these things, but to do so
Right.
in a way that is going to be ultimately fruitful for them?
Right. You have to have a lot of self-knowledge. One of my favorite authors describes a concert goer who goes to a Beethoven concert, and at first is just overwhelmed by the sounds. It's January 1st, it's Beethoven's ninth, and just so excited about the sort of rich symphony. And at some point you say, oh my goodness, I'm enjoying the symphony. I really love Beethoven. I'm really the kind of guy who has the capacity to appreciate Beethoven. Better than a lot of people, actually. I'm a pretty deep guy because I've really studied, at which point the sort of I has moved off of the thing that you were looking at and loved and has pivoted back and is beginning to contemplate you as your capacity for such enjoyment. And I think this happens in, well, this dynamic can play out in almost everything we love, in which we slowly lose the capacity to love the thing because it is rich and beautiful, and lose ourselves in it in a healthy way, and begin to think of ourselves as the possessors of it. And thus we begin to admire ourselves and not the object itself. So I think, to my mind, that's the difference between, I think that's why we find knowledgeable people so loathsome and odious and pedantic sometimes, because what they want to be acknowledged, they want to be acknowledged as for their capacities to control. But those who, ironically, I think real study, rich study, can potentially shatter that image of yourself as a possessor and a controller, because you recognize how rich the field is and it's so beautiful. And you don't talk about yourself and your own acquisitions. You talk about the thing itself, looking along the beam.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful, and I think that's what beauty ought to do. This concept doesn't come from me. I believe it's Elaine Scarry has this concept of beauty decentering us, and that when we are appreciating something beautiful, it shouldn't be that we're turning that thing on ourselves, but it's actually
Yes.
kind of pushing ourselves from the center to
Yes.
appreciate this thing, as you talk about, and get lost in it. So I think
Right.
that's a beautiful place to wrap up. But the real wrap up of the conversation on my channel ends with a segment I call the final four. And so I want to thank you so much for being here today. This has been an absolute joy. I have greatly enjoyed this, and I'm so grateful for your time. This has been a really fun conversation. These questions are an opportunity for the audience to kind of get to know the guest a little bit, and over time it's fun to kind of accumulate the answers from different people on these questions as they kind of get to learn a bit about what has shaped these people. So the first question is, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
I want to say Lectio Divina. This medieval form of chewing on text, this medieval form of refusing to think that you know something until you've worked it into your heart and into your pulses.
Wonderful. That's a great one. Outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
You're asking a college professor, so it's hard to give one. Maybe
I
Dante's
know.
Comedy,
All
maybe
right.
Brothers Karamazov, maybe Plato's Phaedrus, or maybe Homer's Odyssey.
That's a good list. That's a good list. All right. You're having coffee with your undergrad or early grad school self. I know you've been through a decent amount of schooling. What's one advice you give for him for his future in kind of academics and the life that you've led?
Yeah, calm down.
Mm.
It's gonna be okay. I would memorize and quote to him Cavafy's poem Ithaca, and tell him it's going to be a long journey, and enjoy the journey, and stop at Phoenician trading ports, and it's okay. You'll get to Ithaca, and when you do, you'll understand what these Ithacas mean.
That's wonderful. All the questions I ask in some way are selfish because I enjoy getting to do this, but that question specifically, given where I'm at in life, is always one of my favorites to hear. And so I'm going to go look up that poem after this. All
So
right.
beautiful.
I love that. So this channel is called Gospel Simplicity, and it's often pointed out that the topics can be a bit complex, and I recognize that. But the goal is to help people kind of make sense of some of this complexity in a way that maybe moves them slightly towards simplicity. In any case, uh, in one sentence or so, what is this thing called the gospel?
There is a God who is more beautiful than we can fathom, and he invaded our world, seeking sick and broken people to make them more happy than we can imagine.
That is beautiful. I always love getting to listen to these. Well, Dr. Baxter, thank you so much again for your time today. I'd encourage everyone to go check out your book, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, as well as your other ones, which they can find at jasonmbaxter.com. And I'll sign off as I always do by saying until next time, be on the lookout for more videos, but far more important than that, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world.